Good evening. You're watching breaking news here on TVRI World. We come to you live from Jakarta with the latest coverage on the ASEAN-US Summit. This is the final day. The summit is scheduled to take place on the 12th and the 13th of May 2022. The President of the United States, Joe Biden, and 9 ASEAN leaders have converged in Washington, D.C. For the summit to talk about security issues and many other things on the table for the discussions. 9 representatives from 10 ASEAN member states have converged in Washington, D.C. this week for the first US-ASEAN Summit at the White House. They dined with President Joe Biden Thursday evening ahead of a full day of meetings at the U.S. State Department on Friday. Let's go over to Washington, D.C. now with more detailed information on the matter. Joining us is VOA Correspondent Jessica Stone, live from the White House in Washington, D.C. Jessica, a very good morning to you, Washington time. Thank you for joining us.
You bet.
Right. Jessica, what's the highlight of the first day of the summit so far?
Well, Washington has announced $150 million in initiatives that range from clean energy development and public-private partnerships all the way to the digital economy and efforts to help on climate change and healthcare. One of the more interesting developments and announcements is this team that Washington plans to send, a Coast Guard team to the region that will be permanently stationed there to train Southeast Asian Coast Guards on maritime situational awareness. Obviously, this is critical for what's going on in the South China Sea with respect to fishing rights and natural resources, as well as security and freedom of navigation. So that will begin. And of course, Indonesia has been a big supporter of Coast Guard cooperation throughout the region. So that plays right into what Jakarta is thinking as well. The U.S. also announced its largest trade mission in the world will be held in Thailand next year, 2023, and it will also take a couple more trade missions at the end of this year to the region. And then the other interesting development, I thought, was this Johns Hopkins School program that is designed now to train specific young Southeast Asian leaders. 3 leaders from each of the 10 member states will be invited to come each year to the SAIS school, which is a pretty instrumental and famous international relations school here in Washington. They will be invited for a program for international leadership development. And of course, that has echoes, if you remember, during the first Sunnylands US-ASEAN Summit, President Obama also announced an effort to train more Southeast Asian leaders. And so we're excited to announce that program as well.
All right, Jessica, Friday is the final day of the summit. What can we expect for the final day of the summit and for all of these leaders to talk about and to come up with some concrete deliverables?
Well, in many ways, I think the expectation for concrete deliverables should be lowered because we are not getting any signals from here in Washington that there'll be any major economic announcements or further announcements with respect to Washington programming. However, there will be meetings with Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State. Each country will get a one-on-one meeting privately and briefly with U.S. President Joe Biden. And interestingly enough, U.S. and ASEAN leaders have all agreed to have an empty chair at every group meeting representing Myanmar and, of course, a protest, really, of the military coup back in 2021 that overtook the country and removed the civilian democratically elected leadership there. ASEAN, of course, did not offer an invitation to Myanmar's current ruling junta leader. So this is how the group is really agreeing to protest what's going on in Myanmar. And obviously, that's a big talking point for today's discussions. We'll end the day with a plenary session. Everybody will have remarks. And then what we'll be watching for is a vision statement coming out of that meeting. That will be instrumental in setting the tone for future U.S.-ASEAN relations.
Right. You mentioned empty chairs for Myanmar. How is Washington navigating the human rights and anti-democratic issues in Myanmar and also elsewhere in terms of democratic issues throughout the summit?
Well, Kirk Campbell, the Indo-Pacific advisor, was asked this question earlier this week about human rights and the tightrope, really, that the Biden administration is walking with respect to trying to improve relations with Southeast Asia and at the same time call out human rights abuses in the region. The U.S. says that this is not simply an ASEAN problem, that it does support ASEAN's pathway that it's attempting to give to the junta towards a more democratic outcome. But Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman also met with the opposition party, which is in Washington for meetings as well. So they had a one-on-one meeting with her. Still, the White House coming under human rights groups' criticisms for even having the summit at all at the White House, because we did get that lasting image yesterday of all of the leaders side by side with U.S. President Joe Biden. And for some in the human rights community, what that communicates is some level of overlooking these abuses in the interest of strengthening ties in the region.
Right. Jessica, you mentioned briefly earlier that we should lower our expectations when it comes to concrete deliverables, meaning that we are also not expecting any major economic engagement announcements at the summit. And why is that? And when will that change?
Well, we know from the White House that they are really trying to lengthen the ramp to announce the economic framework. This is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and we expect it to be announced when President Biden is actually in the region. He, of course, will be going next week to South Korea as well as to Japan, and we anticipate he will make a large speech and announcement of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework in Tokyo at the end of the month. That is an acronym that they're calling here in Washington, the IPEF, but it's being described by analysts as somewhat weak tea because it does not have any global market access or any market access provisions in it. We still don't know what the digital provisions for digital economy are going to be in it. And, you know, it is a bit of a U.S. response, Johnny come lately, to what has already been in the region, which of course is the CPTPP, which China is now asking to join. That was, of course, the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Trump administration pulled the United States out of. And China now has the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the largest free trade agreement in the world and which is active in the region, and many ASEAN members are committed to it already.
Right, right. My final question to you, Jessica, before we conclude our conversations. The U.S., through President Joe Biden, has over and over again stressed the centrality of ASEAN to its Indo-Pacific strategy to contain China, meaning that ASEAN, as one of the strongest bloc in the world, has some bargaining power. What's your take on this?
Bargaining power? Is that the word you used?
Yeah, for the ASEAN when it comes to...
Yeah, I think there's growing recognition in the United States that any type of global power competition going forward is really a breakdown between autocratic and democratic values. And so with respect to ASEAN, you know, there is a tremendous amount of potential in economic development and supply chain management and diversity. So many American companies are already moving, as are European companies, some of their operations to Southeast Asia to become less dependent on Chinese manufacturing and Chinese supply chains, with this caveat that many of those manufacturers are Chinese run in the region. However, yes, these are major trading routes throughout ASEAN. And of course, you think of the Straits of Malacca around Singapore. It's critical for the U.S. to really focus on the Pacific. And with respect to North Korea and the AUKUS agreement with Australia, there's a lot of momentum going forward for the U.S. to really understand that in order to counter China, it needs the support of the global community, and it's certainly not something it can do on its own. With that said, I would just add that the United States continues to have to recognize that China is a neighbor, a next-door neighbor to much of ASEAN. And so with respect to economic development, there are already longstanding economic ties between ASEAN and China. And there are also a lot of mutual security concerns that ASEAN shares with China, particularly around the Pacific. So it is a tightrope, as I would describe it, to walk for the U.S. government, but nonetheless a very important one. And I think it's fair to say that this government really recognizes the centrality not only of ASEAN, but of Southeast Asia to its Indo-Pacific strategy. That is certainly the case they're going to be trying to make in the region at the president's visit next week.
Right, there's certainly going to be some power play there, not to mention AUKUS and also the Quad, which consists of US, Australia, Japan, and India. Live from Washington, D.C., correspondent of VOA America, Jessica Stone, thank you very much for your reports on the ASEAN-US Summit.
My pleasure.
Well, this week, 8 Southeast Asian leaders descend on Washington for a special summit hosted by President Joe Biden. They represent most of the associations of Southeast Asian nations, or ASEAN, a diverse grouping ranging from the city-states of Singapore to the sprawling archipelago of Indonesia. Taken together, ASEAN's 10 countries boast populations of over 680 million, more than Latin America, the Middle East, or the European Union, forming the 5th largest economy in the world with a GDP of over 3.2 trillion US dollars. And we'll get to hear later on the formal statements from the government of the Republic of Indonesia, particularly from the President Joko Widodo upon returning in due time from Washington, D.C. to let us in on what's been transpired in Washington, D.C. for a 2-day summit of ASEAN and the U.S. And this ends this evening's breaking news here on TVRI World. I'm Rahmat Idris. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye for now.